The crate smelled of dry hay, horse sweat, and her own fear. Alara pressed herself into the furthest corner, splinters biting her cheek, listening to the muffled world outside. Heavy boots tramped past. Voices, rough and indifferent, bartered and swore. This timber box, meant for livestock, was her fragile sanctuary, a desperate gamble against the unknown. Hunger gnawed, a dull ache that had become a constant companion. The cold, too, had settled deep in her bones days ago, no matter how tightly she hugged her thin shawl. She was 16, alone and hiding like vermin. Her Aunt Maeve's cruelty had become unbearable after Papa's death. The endless chores, the meager food, the cold, calculating way Maeve spoke of marrying her off to old Silas Croft, who smelled of stale pipe smoke and avarice. Alara had seen her chance when the horse traders came, eyeing the sturdy mare Papa had loved. She'd slipped into the crate intended for transport just hours before it was loaded, praying she wouldn't be discovered until they were miles away. Now, every scrape, every shout outside the rough wood, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. What if they found her? What would they do? Sell her like the horse? Beat her? Send her back to a fate worse than this cramped, dark prison? A sudden silence fell, different from the usual clamor. Then, the heavy thud of the crate being lifted, tilted. She slid, crying out softly as her head struck the wood. Muffled voices again, closer now. One voice lower and more deliberate than the others. She's a sturdy mare. Good bone, not the auctioneer. A buyer. The crate was set down again, jarringly. Another silence. Anticipation heavy in the air. Then, a sharp rap on the wood near her head. Her heart leaped. She froze, barely breathing. Another rap. Anything else in there? The voice was deep, calm, unsettlingly close. Not a question asked lightly. He knew or suspected. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shrink smaller, willing herself invisible. The latch rattled. Heavy boots scraped on the ground outside the opening door. Sunlight, harsh and blinding after the darkness, flooded in. She flinched, raising a trembling hand to shield her eyes. A silhouette filled the opening, tall, broad-shouldered, framed by the bright sky. He stooped slightly, peering into the gloom. His face was shadowed, unreadable. Only his eyes were visible, gray and sharp, scanning the space where the horse had been. They landed on her huddled form. He didn't recoil. He didn't shout. He simply stopped, his gaze steady, assessing. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and her potent fear. "Well now," the man said, his voice quiet, without surprise or anger, just a low observation. "What in the devil's name have we here?" Alara couldn't speak. Her throat was tight with terror. She looked up at him from her huddled position, a small creature caught in a trap. His face was rugged, weathered, lines etched around his eyes and mouth like marks on old leather. He wore plain, dark clothes, practical and worn, like the man himself. Not a trader, not a townsman she recognized. An outsider, perhaps. His expression remained unreadable, neither cruel nor kind, just observant. He straightened slowly, the sudden space above her head making her feel even smaller. "You gonna get out?" he asked. It wasn't an invitation. It was a quiet command. She hesitated, fear warring with the desperate need to escape the confines of the crate. What choice did she have? Staying here meant discovery by others, perhaps those who would harm her. This man, at least for this moment, was an unknown quantity. Slowly, stiffly, her limbs aching, she unfolded herself from the corner. Hay clung to her shawl and skirt. She was unsteady on her feet, her legs cramped. She stumbled towards the opening. He stepped back just enough to let her clamber out, offering no hand. The ground felt strange and solid beneath her feet. She stood blinking in the harsh sunlight, dust motes dancing in the air. The auction yard was a short distance away, noise drifting over, but here, beside the quiet mare tied to a post, it felt momentarily isolated. He looked at her fully now, taking in her disheveled appearance, the fear in her eyes, the cheap fabric of her dress. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from. "You ain't the mare I paid for," he stated, stating the obvious with dry finality. "Seems I bought." Extra, he ran a hand over the mare's neck, his touch gentle despite the gruffness of his presence. The horse nudged his hand. He seemed more comfortable with the animal than with the unexpected human complication. Alara wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the sun. I had nowhere else," she whispered, her voice raspy. It was barely a sound. He turned back to her, his gray eyes steady. He didn't press for details, didn't demand explanations. His silence was heavy, leaving her exposed. He looked towards the dusty road leading out of the yard, then back at her, a calculation happening behind his eyes. It was clear she was a problem, an unwelcome burden. "Well," he said, his gaze sweeping over the empty crate, the mare, and finally settling on her. "Can't leave you here for the vultures." I suppose it wasn't charity. It sounded more like weary resignation. He untied the mare. "Can you ride?" he asked, already swinging himself into the saddle. It wasn't a question expecting a complex answer. It was logistical. "Yes," she managed, relief making her voice tremble. Papa had taught her. "Then get up behind me. We're leaving." He didn't offer to help her up. She had to scramble onto the mare's back, her movements clumsy, finding a precarious seat behind him. He didn't look back as he urged the mare forward, heading away from the noisy yard, towards the wide, indifferent horizon. The silence between them stretched for hours, broken only by the rhythmic hoofbeats of the mare and the creak of the saddle. He rode with a quiet competence, his back straight, his gaze fixed ahead. Alara clung to his coat, the rough wool scratching her cheek. She dared not speak, fearing she would break the fragile, unspoken truce that kept her from being cast off onto the dusty road. He hadn't asked again why she was hiding, or who she was fleeing. He hadn't offered comfort or reassurance. His presence was like the landscape, vast, unyielding, and demanding. Yet he hadn't stopped. He hadn't abandoned her. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, he finally pulled the mare to a halt near a shallow creek bed. The water was clear, cold. He dismounted with an easy grace, then turned and extended a hand, a simple, unexpected gesture. Alara took it, her fingers cold against his calloused palm, and slid carefully to the ground. Her legs were stiff, her body sore from the ride. He went to the creek, cupped his hands, and drank, then let the mare drink. He didn't offer her water, but she saw his canteen on the saddle. Hesitantly, she approached the creek herself and knelt, scooping the icy water to her mouth. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. He watched her, his expression still guarded. After they had watered the mare, he rummaged in his saddlebags and pulled out a hunk of dry bread and some jerky. He broke the bread in half, handing her the larger piece without a word. It wasn't much, but it was food, freely given. She ate slowly, savoring every crumb, acutely aware of his presence nearby. He ate his own portion, his movements economical and quiet. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the temperature plummeted. A biting wind whipped across the open land. He built a small, efficient fire, the flames leaping against the growing darkness. He sat on one side of the fire, she on the other, the flickering light between them. The silence returned, less heavy now, companionable in a strange, tentative way. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask his. He seemed content with the anonymity, the lack of questions. But the shared food, the shared fire, these were small bridges built across the chasm of their solitude. Looking at him across the firelight, seeing the quiet strength in his posture, the careful way he tended the flames, Alara felt a tiny easing of the knot of fear in her chest. She was still lost, still fleeing, still utterly dependent on a stranger. But for the first time in days, she wasn't completely alone. The vast, cold night felt slightly less terrifying with his silent, watchful presence nearby. Days blurred into a rhythm of riding, sparse meals, and silent camps. They spoke little. He was Silas, he'd said finally, one evening by the fire, offering the name without fanfare. She had offered Alara in return. That was the extent of their introductions. Silas was a man of actions, not words. He ensured she had a share of their meager supplies, pointed out the safest way across rocky ground, and chose campsites sheltered from the wind. He never touched her, never spoke a harsh word, but his gaze remained watchful, assessing. One afternoon, as they rode through a narrow canyon, the sky darkened ominously. A storm was brewing, fast and fierce. Silas spurred the mare, urgency in his movements. "Looks like we're in for it," he called over the wind, the most words he'd strung together at once. They found a shallow overhang in the canyon wall just as the first drops of rain began to fall, quickly turning into a torrential downpour mixed with hail. The mare whickered nervously. They huddled together for warmth beneath the rock, the storm raging outside. The cold was intense, seeping through their clothes. Alara shivered uncontrollably. Silas looked at her, his gaze losing some of its customary reserve. Without a word, he shrugged off his worn, heavy coat, the only significant layer he had, and placed it around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and horse and the faint, clean scent of rain. It was rough, but warm, a shield against the biting cold. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He just nodded, his jaw set as he watched the storm. In that moment, wrapped in his coat, the storm roaring around them, she felt a profound sense of being protected. It wasn't pity in his eyes, but a quiet, practical concern for her survival. When the storm finally passed, leaving the air clean and cold and the ground slick with mud, something had shifted between them. The unspoken barrier had thinned. Later that evening, huddled by a fire struggling against the damp wood, he finally asked, his voice low, "Who are you running from, Alara?" She hesitated. Then the words spilled out, haltingly at first, then with more conviction. The cruelty of her aunt, the forced marriage, her papa's death, the desperate escape. He listened without interruption, his face unreadable in the firelight. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was different now, filled with understanding, not just absence. He looked into the flames for a long moment. "Ain't much out there for a lone woman," he said finally, stating a simple, brutal truth. "Where were you headed?" I don't know," she admitted, the vulnerability sharp. "Anywhere but there," he considered this, his gaze meeting hers across the fire. "My place isn't much," he said slowly. "Small cabin, isolated, but it's shelter. And nobody would look for you there. It wasn't an offer of forever, or even safety from the world's general harshness. It was simply a temporary harbor, offered without grand gestures, just a quiet acknowledgement of shared need." Relief washed over her, so strong it made her eyes sting. She nodded, unable to find words. They reached Silas's cabin 2 days later. It was indeed small, nestled in a remote valley, unassuming and weathered, but it stood solid against the vastness of the land. It felt less like a destination and more like a pause, a temporary anchorage in a journey that felt far from over. Life there was simple, dictated by the rhythms of the land and the weather. Silas worked the small plot of land, tended to the mare and a few chickens. Alara helped where she could, learning the quiet cadence of his days. He didn't ask her to stay, didn't demand her help, but accepted it with the same quiet reserve he accepted everything. Their conversations remained sparse, centered around practical matters. The planting, the weather, fixing a loose board on the fence. Yet, in the shared tasks, the silent meals across the rough-hewn table, the evenings spent by the fire, a different kind of understanding grew. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight tension in his shoulders, the rare, brief moments when his guard lowered. He, in turn, saw her not just as a scared girl from a crate, but as someone capable, resilient, with a quiet determination that mirrored the toughness of the land itself. She was no longer just hiding. She was building something small and fragile here, finding a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The fear hadn't vanished entirely. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the old terror would creep back in, a cold hand squeezing her heart. But now, the fear was tempered by a newfound strength, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She had faced the unknown, clung to hope in the darkness, and found an unexpected ally in a quiet, solitary man. Her journey hadn't ended at the cabin door. The world outside remained large and uncertain, with potential threats still lurking. But the girl who had hidden in the hay-filled crate was gone. In her place stood a young woman who had looked despair in the eye and kept moving, who had found unexpected kindness in a harsh land, and who faced the future not with paralyzing fear, but with a quiet, earned dignity. The silence between her and Silas was no longer a void, but a space filled with shared experience, unspoken trust, and the quiet promise of facing whatever came next, together or apart, with a newfound strength forged in hardship.